So I'm the technical developers coordinator for the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots Coalition for the UK. And one of the things that we're working on is a technical paper to answer some of the questions that nobody's asking. And it's really quite extraordinary that they're not. So one of the things I'm going to take the opportunity to do here is go through some of the specific technologies, the lack, the inabilities that make the technology really quite unfeasible and impracticable on the ground. So the ethical discussion is one that lots of people have, and it seems quite an obvious one to me myself, but it's something that I hope that we can have when we open it out. I'm going to go through some of the current laws. Obviously, this won't be exhaustive because we have 20-25 minutes, and I want to get to some of the technical issues. But I'm going to give a sort of a grounding of a bit where we are, and more importantly, the precedents, because there's some legal pushback, and I'd like to give some comforting reasons as to why there's no real reason why we shouldn't have a ban against these weapon systems. And as Neve's alluded to, we're going to put some poll questions because we have two things. We have a university's questionnaire, which should be one data gathering, but also a little bit provocative, hopefully, and enabling to some universities. If there are some universities, I have a list that can go up later, 13 universities we engage with that are doing research or are funded by weapons developers, military, and we are engaging with them to see how they might enable themselves better to disassociate from those networks if they choose to. And there seems to be strong student and faculty support for that, differing degrees in those areas. So we can go into that later. So there will be some polls as to how comfortable, what the knowledge is amongst people as to their involvement in their university and faculty and funding, and how comfortable they are with their research contributing to autonomous weapon systems. So I'm going to go into current law. Now, there are a few, these are just sort of some of the flagship things. Now, Martin's clause is it's a clause which generally defers to, if nothing else, if there is no specific law pertaining to an action engaged in a particular conflict, failing nothing else, rely on the best practice, the most recent, the highest, the most applicable law that there is, due to the fact that international law comes, and that's a lot of preamble, and the end of the sentence is, comes from the laws of humanity and the requirements of a public conscience. And what Martin's clause is basically saying is, at all times, if there is no specific law that you can ascribe to an action or a behavior, act in the best interests of humanity and morality, and something that would comply with a greater sense of public conscience. And it's a sort of customary practice in the public humanity and conscience. And there are some articles of the Geneva Convention, Protocol 1, which apply. And in general, to summarize them, they basically speak to general obligations in which states parties to conflicts must have obligations to either do certain things or prevent certain actions or activities which cause indiscriminate attacks, for example, or discriminate. So in general, there's proportionality, which is where you get sort of calculations of collateral damage, which is a term you may have heard. It requires lawyers often to be in the room to help make certain decisions as to the legality of certain strikes so that they comply with law and will stand up to scrutiny. This is where international humanitarian law, and with Britain we have LOAC, which is the laws of armed conflict. Now, humanitarian law is actually the laws of war. These govern discrimination, indiscriminate killing, aspiring against the standards of human morality, and being able to distinguish fundamentally certain peoples like the injured, the surrendered, the stranded at sea, and civilians, of course. And this is hors de combat. So someone should be able to surrender, and even if they were a soldier, a combatant, they are no longer kind of fair game for a strike. Now, how would a machine be coded to recognize such a thing? So we'll see whether the technology can ever allow us to deliver the aspects and comply with law. Now, current technology is actually delivering some quite impressive things. There was a DARPA TopCat exercise, which has been in the news, and from a technical point of view was quite a feat. There were sort of 20 or so exercises, and it was basically AI against machine. It was aircrafts flown by our best Top Gun pilots. One of our technical experts actually observed it and said it was extremely impressive. But it was a simulation. There was no dissembling, no noise, no faint, nothing unpredictable happened, nothing to obscure, nothing that is actually our issue from a technical standpoint that could obscure or confuse the machines that have been programmed. So there were 20 maneuvers within about 30,000 miles, 3,000 miles, excuse me, an engagement over 1,000 miles, and it was a line of sight. This is not a dogfight. There's no skewing. There's no noise, there's no unpredictability. It was a clean and highly rule-based simulation. So even though everyone sort of celebrated this, no one's actually speaking to the real point of the issue, which is the confusion that comes with noise. A general has said that a quarter of our army will be robotics by 2030. It's a wild and obscure thing to say, and we would challenge that. So we go to some of the legal pushback. Now, thousands of roboticists who are experts in the field have been saying that they are appalled by the notion that machine learning and AI could be used to track, select, target, engage, and then lethally potentially strike human beings and civilian infrastructure. And in 2019, they have signed an open letter to the UN in July, which went from 1,000 to 2,000 signatories within weeks. It's now reached 20,000. It has some famous roboticists and scientists and a few famous names, Stephen Hawking, Noam Chomsky, Elon Musk, but the names grow. And it's the sort of thing that you can get universities, faculties, individual academics, whole pension funds to sign up to. We've done that for previous disarmament campaigns. Now, I want to give a brief description of how the legal precedents are actually quite important. So there is an argument that you can't ban technology preemptively. Well, in the case of blinding lasers, for example, there was an argument that you can't ban something that's in development and doesn't exist. Well, blinding lasers were banned in 1995, and one of the concerns were from the scientists themselves. And they said they were appalled by the notion that such a technology, which could bring such good, we have laser eye surgery, it didn't stop the existence of that, could be used to blind individuals, civilians or soldiers, because of war, or even border control or policing use. It was banned in 1995, and we do have laser eye surgery. So the idea that it could stifle medical or technological advancement for good uses it's not played out. Biological Weapons Convention allows states parties to divert their stockpiles to peaceful uses, as with the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons. They actually encourage the transfer of this technological advancement and the sharing and the collaboration for the advancement of human knowledge. So again, the idea that it's sort of stifling it it doesn't play out. The Chemical Weapons Convention, the Mine Ban Treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munitions prohibits under any circumstances the use, development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, retention, and transfer, as well as the assistance with those prohibited activities. Now, why that's relevant is that we're not just talking about the use of these prohibited weapons in a time of war. It applies in peaceful uses, therefore applies to law enforcement, border control and such, but it's also research and development. It can be funding, it can be collaborating, all these things, which means that at university stage where research is being done, the ability to say we will not comply with this, we will not contribute, can be really quite powerful. Now, finally, legal accountability, the issues of verification, chain of command, the role of the ICJ and the ICC, sanctions, economic sanctions, financial, trade, and such things, somewhat answers the question that constantly gets fired at us, which, well, what about if Russia builds it? Who cares if you ban something and then the technology already exists? There have been pre-existing technologies, for example, mines. After the Ottawa Convention banned cluster munitions, Many of them were swept. When anti-personnel mines were banned, I think 40 million were eradicated. I'd have to check that number. But it does speak to the fact that that stigmatization alone and the ability to verify can actually prevent the overdevelopment or the continued development of infrastructure and technologies and the collaboration thereof. And it can actually, for want of a better phrase, without carrot and stick, the kind of international bullying that can take place, it can actually prevent these things from escalating. Now, this example here, I put this slide up, is really important because it speaks to human control and autonomy. Anti-personnel mines are sensor-based, and they are essentially set off by the proximity and pressure of the victim. Now, it has no way of deciphering whether the victim is a combatant or an individual or a child or any other kind of civilian, as we know. And the images of maimed children were very powerful and quite a publicity arresting image, which helped get these things banned. It was the reason that indiscriminate harm, remember that legal phrase, which was quite powerful in having them banned. The United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution around chemical weapons, noting that they were in violation of international law because, and I quote here, the effects are often uncontrollable, unpredictable, and injurious without distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons have all been banned, partly due to the fears that they cause excessive human suffering, and I'm quoting one of them. So issues of human control and excessive indiscriminate suffering to humans have actually been reasons for their banning. Now, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons in particular noted the disproportionate harm to women and girls. That's to do with ionizing radiation effects on women's and girls' reproductive systems and increased causes of cancer, and Indigenous communities because of the geographical locations and harms, and facial recognition issues and biases which go into programming, which we've seen in existing systems, whether it's finance, insurance, justice, selection processes. We've seen companies be sued by governments and the other way around because of biases in technology, which are borne out in recidivism or gender-based bias, which to some extent may never ever be eradicated, partly because of human biases and partly because of the vastly restricted ability of data sets. That actually contributes to discrimination, which is unlawful. So let's look at some of these technical issues in a bit of detail. And how long have I got left, Neve?
Basically, you're really good for time, so take as long as you would like.
Great. So I'm going to try and get through the technical parts as quickly as possible in case you have questions. But there are some different issues. Now, the delivery cohort was coined by my great colleague and technical expert, Paddy Walker, who actually gave me a good number of these slides, which are excellent. So there are some distinctions that I'm going to give you now. So you'll hear human in the loop, which are weapon systems that can select targets and deliver force only with a human command. There's human on the loop, which are weapon systems that can select targets and deliver force under the oversight of a human operator who can override the weapon's actions, and human out of the loop, which are weapon systems that are capable of selecting targets and delivering force without any human input. Now, there's another argument that focuses on critical functions, because remember, you're talking about an entire system and it has different components, from sort of scanning an area and then sort of selecting after you've tracked. So you've sort of got to track, you've got to sense, you've got to translate data, turn it into information, make decisions about that information, and then at some point you've got to make a decision as to what is a target, then engage, apply force, and then that becomes a strike. And this has nothing to do with how you decide, how a machine decides whether or not that complies with law. So you can break those up into critical functions, and there's an argument for the fact that because there's already some autonomy in some of these weapons, so I can show you one slide where you have some existing weapons systems. So this one here, I don't know if you can see my mouth, the one that looks a little bit phallic, is a phalanx gun, and it essentially scans the sky or a portion of the sky and uses radar for a very fast oncoming thing, and it's usually a missile. It can be switched on and off by a human being. It can't really move because it's attached to a ship. It can't really change its parameters, and it can't decide, well, I'm not going to scan for that anymore. I'm actually going to point at the sea and scan for something else. So there are some restrictions on it, and it can be turned off and it can be intervened with. It has actually taken down, I think, an Iranian passenger plane. So again, it can make its own mistakes, but there are some limitations there. So there is autonomy and automation within weapon systems, but nothing that goes and makes its own decisions and is autonomous from beginning to end. So we talk about critical functions. So the critical function of targeting, surveillance, target selection, decisions over use and engagement of force. These are moments of critical technical function. And if these decisions are made independently of human oversight and judgment, the machine or the system using machine learning, evolving any mistakes that are within the data set, then evolve and increasingly make it increasingly kind of open that widening gyre of mistakes and biases. And that's a problem. So let's think of some of these programs and how they're built, developed, updated, labeled, and why this is a vulnerability in military use. And when you think of this, all the time, think about whether you're comfortable with a machine having been delegated those decisions to take a life. And in fact, don't forget, machines are not moral or legal agents. International law, humanitarian law, human rights law doesn't apply to machines. It applies to individual actors and states, so that chain of command applies to decision makers and accountability can apply to them. Whether it's ethical or not, it can't be legally applicable to them, but it doesn't even look feasible. At best, you can have a highly processed, highly efficient mistake. Let's also not forget the transboundary nature of commerce, the fact that code has a lot of attachments, even updates, even open source has a lot of different participants and stakeholders, which is why I love the delivery cohort model that my colleague Paddy Walker has come up with. And you can't regulate them all in a coherent way. So that's why international law is really the only way that can ban the intent at the end and make very, very specific that a human regulates the act of force, among other things. Now, let's not forget, I mean, a lot of you are involved in tech. Now, Minds Action Canada found that only 12% of the leading researchers working on AI are women, and Wired asserted that 0.00004% have the expertise to build autonomous weapon systems, which doesn't speak well to the fact that the biases are often inherent due to human bias. We know the instances of recidivism, and I've already mentioned some of those things. And you may have seen in the papers some of the problems with facial recognition in policing and border control. So let's look at some of these on-the-ground complexities and how they play out and why they're so problematic. Remember our top cat challenge. The commander has issues on the ground, but they start at the development chain. She has to be able to give practicable orders that will be followed and have feedback in a clear chain of command. Now, a training set is a known case. After a sufficient number of iterations, the computer will be able to use this kind of learned sense data. Using this training set, the sense data will go from this present case in front of it, using the known case, which is its training set, and essentially translate or make its own sort of aggregated understanding in its own language, using what it senses in front of it and based on the previous known case, and make a decision about the thing in front of it. So let's have a look at what this means for critical functions on the ground and how this could ever live up to the hype, because there are some very, very complex coding issues and some very, very basic problems. So bearing in mind a commander needs to translate his intent into the vision of the battle strategy to his troops with a degree of predictability requiring behavioral compliance, reliability, feedback, mitigation or anticipation of issues on the ground, whether there are civilians or things in the way, how they might behave, how they might obfuscate the plan of attack. The same is true of an autonomous weapons system. So upon deployment, and I'll try and get through this quickly so we can move to opening out. Upon deployment, it has to first work the first time and every time. It can't be learning as it goes and hopefully getting on better on the job and making mistakes and learning from those mistakes, because those mistakes are lives, those mistakes are infrastructure, those mistakes could be fratricide, which is harming the self, harming your own troops, harming your own structure. Now it relies on data. And on the battlefield, there's hidden or partially observable camouflage states as a norm. So you'll never get complete or perfect data, which means they are, as a matter of course, a bit of a fudge. You have to backfill with heuristics, which is imagined, filled in data. A good example was given to me. If you need 10 data points and you have 4, the other 6 have to be filled in. Or what's the threshold? Do you say if you only have 3, then ignore it? Does that mean that it becomes invisible? Now, human beings can easily fill in these gaps or look for more information. There are issues of fate, where you can only anticipate so many actions, but then the adversary does something completely unexpected. So maybe it darts away or it darts around you or it goes left when you expected right. It's a little like spoofing, which you may have heard of. So perhaps a tank is learned as grey and black, but suddenly it's painted yellow. Spoofing a heat-seeking missile, for example, is typically you light a flare behind it so that the heat behind it confuses it and it doesn't know which direction to go in anymore. It was going that way and suddenly it thinks it should turn around and go the other way. You see how easily data can be confused. There's another issue with class boundaries within ATR, which is automatic target recognition. So whatever specific data it has come to recognize as the object, say a certain length and shape, with some variations. Once it's partially obfuscated, either by another object, a tree, a building, weather, dust, the data noise you would expect in war. Now this is all maths. So the pixels actually become indistinct to the extent that the computer doesn't understand the object at all. Likewise, for some shiny thing over a hill that wasn't supposed to be there, the oddity, the anomaly becomes smoothed out. Now, machine learning is utterly intrinsically reliant on these class boundaries in its training sets and how to match these. So anomalies become difficulties that have to be got around. Now, finally, predictability. Many of you may be familiar with this in concept systems, and broadly, this is the ongoing problem that a particular decision might be made and we don't really know why, because of all the data that's fed into the machine within the data training set. As much as it may be coming back with an accurate reading of, say, this tank that it's reading, and it's starting to say, yes, this is a tank, and we're going, excellent, it's getting tank right 9 out of 10 times. We don't understand how it's reading tank. Is it length? Is it shape? What sort of geometry of data is it reading as tank? So when it starts making mistakes, we don't know what to correct because we don't know what it understood as tank. And when it gets out into the field, where it's much noisier, we don't understand if it's still making those mistakes. So one of 2 things could happen. Either it starts seeing other things and misreading them as tanks, or it doesn't read tanks at all because of that obfuscation I mentioned, the class boundary sort of violation, or it blows up other things that it thinks are a tank and it says, yeah, I was only blowing up tanks. And therefore, unfortunately, Article 36 reviews, which say that you have to comply with IHL when you procure weapons and you pass weapons and you say that they're fit for the battlefield, will say to the people and to their governments and to the UN and to the verification processes, which I spoke of, no, our weapons comply completely. Look at the accuracy readings. And they may say that they are being accurate, but actually they are tremendously violating war. I'll go through just a couple more things because I think they're quite important. Feedback loops are very important to people and generally need to constantly tweak and guide alterations, slightly because of those mistakes. Because if an autonomous weapons system, if this computer essentially on board this system is updating its own software, but it's updating mistakes and it's doing something like forgetting valuable information and retaining the mistake, then we have a problem. And if a human being isn't adjusting it in the right direction and it's updating in the wrong direction, then you have a bit of a Frankenstein mistake. If there's buzz and a machine says, oh, that's a problem, I'm going to smooth that out, it doesn't have the sensitivity of a human being to go, oh, buzz, that's something I have to pay attention to. And finally, the undeclared consumer is something I'll mention. Now, this is a computer-generated output of one process. And the computer-generated output of one process will consume into the required inputs for the next one, a little bit like dominoes. Now, if that's wrong, that output is wrong, it becomes a sort of a false premise, a mistaken building block for the next one. Now, all of these require intervention. So it's not just the sensed data points that are data inputs, but actually the other computer kernels that become part of the sort of evolved, the machine learning, the ongoing evolved set that becomes its kind of new frame of reference. So this idea that but we trained it and we trained it well, and the data training set worked in the lab, and therefore it's as if you've given it a really good dictionary, so all the words that it will learn will be clean and none of them will be imperfect or violent or hard, is actually kind of a false understanding, because you don't even know if the learning sets were accurate, and actually it can keep relearning mistakes or on the basis of that sort of widening gyre of mistakes. This doesn't even touch the fact that machines break down, they can be hacked, there's fratricide, and they can, the spoofing I mentioned, and the cost of the fact that they need to be updated and all of those things. Software updates, my computer updates its own software all the time, and if something's been labeled incorrectly, a software update can actually crash a system. So we see that there are basic technical issues that deem it practically impracticable in ways that aren't even being thought about or talked about before we even discuss the greater, wider ethical and legal concerns, but show that on a fundamental level, it's actually, I'm just going to put some of the coding lists here before I make my final point, that it's almost impossible to make this practicable on the ground, let alone ethical, and comply with the international humanitarian legal requirements to know that you have a weapon that can distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. How on earth could it know? How on earth could a machine ever understand intent? How could it translate the intent of the commander? And how could it possibly translate legal coding? So those are just obvious questions. And finally, I'm just going to put up a list of the universities, the 13 universities that we're engaged with who do some of this research, and remind of the fact that this is the first time in history that some of the most advanced technological advancements are not being led by the military. They're on the back foot. It's actually coming from the universities and the startups, which is a really powerful place to be. So what can you do? You can appeal to your unions, your faculty, your board, find out where your funding's coming from, find out if the research is steered towards their asks. You can talk to your departments, and you can sign the Future of Life Pledge, which is the Lethal Autonomous Weapons Pledge, to say that you don't want your research to go to such weapon systems. You can ask your researchers and ask exactly what you're working on and what the intended purposes are, because of course some of this technology is dual use. Something that could end up in a driverless car could end up in a weapon system. You can demand that that doesn't happen. You can ask for transparency when you join the workforce around a similar thing. Now, a good example of this was Project Maven and Google, for Google and Clarify, were Department of Defense projects, a bit like the Dragonfly project at Google. They were surveillance models, and it used machine learning to sort through mass surveillance data. And it was basically recce for drones, and that's what it was. But the workers did not know what they were working on, and it utterly violated the ethics principles of their companies. And they staged mass walkouts, and it made the companies change their policies and abandon those projects. In theory. Unfortunately, they've since started to work on others, but you do have power as the workforce. So there are a lot of things that you can do. And it is the first time the power isn't actually with the military on those things, because as some of us have talked to, not everyone knows what the real issues are on these, and I've just touched on a few of the basics. I think it's time to wrap up because I think I've gone hugely over. But there are a lot of issues, and I haven't even spoke of the ethical ones because I'm quite keen to hear what you have to say. So I think that's it from me. Let's find I'll put the some of the technical stuff up, and then I can find you a nice picture of a robot. So that's it from me. I'm going to switch my mic off and go over to Neve. Thank you.
That was great, Taniel. Thank you so much for that thorough overview of kind of the legal setting for these developments, and then really going into the tech. I think it's really helpful to kind of help explain the issue around laws, especially like looking at it from a systems perspective. It's important, I think, not to drop the S on the end of the acronym. So I think we've already got a good number of questions in the Q&A box, which is excellent. I'm going to be cheeky and ask a question myself first, if that's okay, because it's something I always think about. I'm partly based in a computer science faculty as part of my own PhD. And I know we have a lot of research going on in my department that on the face of it isn't hugely relevant to laws, but things like computer vision, for example, that's something that has many applications, for example, in driverless cars, but also down the line, it could contribute to the development of laws or lethal autonomous weapon systems. So I was wondering if, from the perspective of someone who is a research student, who might be working on research that is quite abstract at the moment, but might have laws applications in the future, and they're concerned about this, how would you recommend they kind of inform themselves or kind of move forward in their research to make sure that their work isn't used for something that they disagree with ethically down the line?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really important question. I'll go back to the, I'll put this back up there. I hope you can see it because I've opened my chat box. So I've put there no reverse engineering. I think it's the fifth point down. No reverse engineering and intended use only. You can actually, so when you contract and you work on things, the first thing is I mean, it depends, right? So if you're working in a huge company, sometimes the thing that the company you're working for, it belongs to them, right? So you have to, that's why I say ask for transparency when joining the workforce, because I would say you want to know what you're working on at the company and the company's intention. And I would say that there is ongoing transparency there, and that each project you're working on, I would do it that way. If you're working on something at a university, if that's the sort of research that you're talking about, I would say the same thing, but you can be much more specific, because you're empowered at a university because you pay them, and actually they have to deliver to you. They're supposed to be educating you. And if you're working on a research project, you're also contributing to something overall. So you have that you have a different sort of power, but it's similar. Whereas at a company, they more often than not own your work. This is why I really love our universities campaign, and it's really exciting, because you do have a power through your union and they've done it through all sorts of divestment projects for different things, to say, we don't want to be funded by this, we don't want any links to that sort of work. But there are, I go to the no reverse engineering and intended use only, because there are actually specific contract clauses. So if you were to work on something or to sell something, what you would say is, if you want to buy this thing that I built, say you you built a program, or you built some algorithmic tool, and someone said, that's really impressive, I want to buy it. You would have written in, and some of them are implied, apparently, is my understanding, but I would never be comfortable enough with that. I would want it written in and signed up to. You would write in that it cannot be reverse engineered. So you don't want someone to pick it apart. And this is something that states are concerned about. And it happens in tech all the time. You know, a startup makes something very clever and small, and then a bigger, wealthier company tries to figure out how they did it. So they try and reverse the code, essentially. So you can't reverse engineer the thing that I've built. And you can't use it for anything other than the purposes for which I've designed it. So that's a way to protect the intentions for which you created it. And you can try and be as specific as you like in that. And if they don't want to comply with it, then the ball is somewhat in your court. And I would say with research, it's the same thing. You would say, do you have any intention to sell this to a weapons company? And if you do, then I'm not working on it. And then at university, again, this is the quite powerful thing. You as a student body can say, we're not working on research that contributes to a weapons system. And that's where the funding comes in, because you can say, we want funding hygiene. If we're getting funding from this particular weapons company, well, frankly, we want to know what it is they're paying us for. You know, what is it they're expecting for this money? You know, are you comfortable with it, or would you rather that you just don't accept many weapons developers' money? So those are some of the things that you can do. You can either demand that you just never ever have money from a weapons company, or you can say, you know, we'll take the money as long as it's a completely hands-off thing and our research has nothing to do with them, and we want it in writing, and we want it essentially contracted. And there are the Cambridge Lawyers Group are working on legal language to help with things like that. There's also the university's pledge. And if you can get your faculty, your board, your funding board to sign on to it, that can be quite powerful as well, to say, well, look, we're not supposed to be working on it, so my research shouldn't be going there. And if it does, I would imagine that there would be grounds to sue, but you'd have to ask a civil lawyer for that, about that, because I'm not sure, but I imagine so.
Oh, that's great, thank you. So taking some questions now from the chat. We have one from Harry Brown, who's asking about the distinction between a ban and a regulation. So what he's asked, are you suggesting that given current developments, should there be a ban or regulation? And to clarify, is it not possible for autonomous weapons to be effective on the battlefield? And I can also drop in additional question from Mikhail, who's asked, when it comes to assessing how the machines learn and identify targets, you said we would be unable to find out how. Why is that? Is it not possible to program some visualization or parameters which are used to make a decision on whether to attack the target or not? I'll also, at this moment, I'll start our first poll, and so then we can see kind of what our audience is thinking about in terms of laws as well.
Thanks. So the first question was, is there a difference between a ban and regulation? I mean, a ban is a form of regulation. So in that sense, no. But there are incremental forms of regulation. So one could regulate, problematically, you could regulate components of the system, but it wouldn't work because it's a system. So you could regulate one area. It's a bit like saying, you know, you can regulate finance and you can regulate insurance, but it doesn't mean that you're regulating fraud, for example. But yes, a ban is a form of regulation. But one of the things that we're doing at CCW, which is the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which is where the group of government experts on laws is meeting, and that's legally autonomous weapons, is meeting to try and discuss essentially what should happen with this unfolding technology. And some states want to ban, some states think that current law is enough. We think that there should be a ban. And there's sort of a sense that if we don't have a ban, then we would be trying to sort of put the genie back in the bottle, and that's a problem. So that's why for us, a preemptive ban is the only thing that will work, because once it's built, and you can hack and download this technology and just put it into any kind of clumsy hardware, and then it's just too late. But technically speaking, a ban is a form of regulation. It's a form of law. Otherwise, you're just saying we want to sort of regulate the technology once it's in existence. And we're saying you should have an absolute embargo on the use of a lethal or a system that can use force, with machine learning in the surveillance, the sensory kind of system, using machine learning to then target and apply force, because that violates the intention of international law. I don't know if that made sense, that last bit, but and that, I think, is the important part. But a ban is a form of regulation, I think, is the important bit. And what was the next question?
So that was from Mikhail, and that was when it comes to assessing how the machines learn and identify targets, you said that we are unable to find out how. Why is that? Could you not kind of visualize the parameters used to make a decision?
So my understanding is that so the data's fed into the machine, and you could have a billion images, or I don't think it would be a billion, a few million images of a ship, and it's run into the machine, and this is this is the sort of data set, and it's how it's programmed. And eventually the machine starts to sort of come back with its reading of what a ship is, and it starts to kind of aggregate whether, and we don't have any way of knowing whether it's understanding a ship to be a long thing in front of a blue background, because sometimes it will be images in front of, it's at sea, it's in front of a grey sky, it's in a storm, it's at port, and there isn't really any way of knowing what aggregation it's taking to understand to mean ship. So it could be, it's generally this length, and it has a pointy thing that's a mast. And if it's an aircraft carrier, even worse so, because it will have some things on it. And there isn't really any way of knowing visually, because it's maths, it's code, it's written code, what the thing is that it's seeing. So no, it's not something that's visualized, because it's essentially, it's all computer code, and it can't tell us what it's seeing as the ship. It can only tell us, it can only start to come back, because essentially what we're doing is we're testing it. And the only way that we know that it's understood ship is by us testing it as to whether or not it's a ship, and it getting it right that it's a ship. So eventually, let's say it gets ship right 8 out of 10 times. We go, okay, it's seeing ship, but I don't know if it's seeing ship based on an aggregation of the right sense of, well, there's an angle between the mast and the bow, and there are some, if it's an aircraft carrier, there are some planes, and most of the time it gets it right, because sometimes there aren't planes and sometimes there aren't, and we don't know what confuses it and what doesn't. So when it gets out into the real world and it sees something like a mast, and it's a telecoms tower, and it's near an airport, and those are real planes, and there's something long in front of it, so a similar aggregation of that data, which it has been recognizing as an aircraft carrier, and now it's an airport near an embassy's flag with some trucks in front of it, and it shoots it because it thinks it's a ship in front of a stormy sky. Yeah, we have no way of knowing that. I can't conceive, but I'm not enough of an expert to think of what that would look like. There might be someone who can, but of all the people I've spoken to in my research, they can't seem to conceive. There might be someone out there who has an answer for you, and I've asked similar questions. I can't conceive, and from my understanding, the people I've spoken to who are experts in the field can't conceive of how, and say there is no way of the program to tell the programmer what it's understanding to be a ship and what it's missing. So even if it gets ship right every time, or it gets it wrong and it says, oh, I got it wrong, or right, it wouldn't itself know the mistake that it was making, because as far as it's concerned, it's seeing a ship. So I beyond that, I haven't got an answer for you, because when I've asked similar questions, the answer was always can't conceive of it. I can't conceive of it, and they've never had an answer for me. Sorry.
Thank you. I think that was a helpful explanation of something that I think is very difficult to communicate about. I'll end the polling now from our first question, and we can look at the results. So the first question that we asked was, would you join an institution that openly contributed to the research and development for AI and weapons system? And so we had 2 respondents saying yes, 8 saying no, and 3 saying don't know or don't mind. The second component of this was if this became a project of the institution after joining, would this be an issue of concern? And 92% or 12 respondents said yes, and 1 said no. So it's interesting that in the audience we have a lot of concern around the research and development of AI and weapon systems. I'll launch another poll in a moment. And maybe we can discuss 2 more questions that we have. We're actually running out of time. I think there's so much enthusiasm.
What were the 2 questions?
So from Emily, we have, given that research into laws has been happening for some time, creating sector inertia and military industrial complexes in major military states are seemingly quite invested in moving laws tech forward. What can civil society do to pressure governments to decouple their strategic planning and forecasting from laws? In short, how can we resist the global military industrial complex? Great question. And then Tom Hickey has asked, who should be responsible for providing guidelines, regulations, and ethics for laws development and deployment?
Goodness, the big questions. I mean, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Emily, about the inertia, and that's something that we've been dealing with. I think the important part is that civil society is actually quite powerful here, because the tech is actually in the commercial sector. It involves a lot of it is to do with data analysis. So this is in the area of finance, it's in the area of insurance, it's research for, you know, Neve brought up, it could be driverless cars, or but you're involved in, you might have a pension, you might be a student, you might be on the faculty, you might be, so some of the things I've already mentioned. I mean, I can say things like writing letters to your MP, or but if you have if you have a pension fund, if you're at the workplace and you have a union, they are massively powerful bodies that when they divest from something, when they divest something from their portfolio. So we're going to be talking to, I mean, I'm doing this research piece that will be going to government, it was going to be for the autumn, but as we've all noticed, things have somewhat changed. And part of that will be explaining to the government how perhaps, and we'll see what we'll see what these polls return just here, and the questionnaire that's university wide, that perhaps the people who are responsible for building the technology aren't so inclined to build the technology that ends up in lethally or potentially extremely destructive weapon systems. And that perhaps people whose public funds, so pensions, national pensions are, you know, this is your public funds and your taxes, don't want their money to be invested into these weapon systems. So you have every right to ask your pension, for example, and your bank where your money is being invested. So when you put money into your bank invests the money that it has. You can ask that your money doesn't go to anything like this. So in fact, this applies to all sorts of things. You know, it could apply to nuclear weapons, it could apply to all sorts of things. It could apply to fossil fuels if that's what you care about. So this is a general point. There's a lot more, you have a lot more power as a consumer than you think, especially when it comes to public funds, because they belong to you, they're yours. And if you write in and you say, I don't want my money going towards and funding these, what I call these unethical or toxic, whatever they are, I want it taken out, then if there's enough of a groundswell, certainly when it comes to your funds at your bank, you have a lot more power. You can actually say, I don't want it to go there. And if it gets to that point, if enough of them do, and I've seen it because I've worked on enough campaigns where that's what we have lists, we have halls of fame and halls of shame, which banks, which pension funds, which investment funds, and they eventually they divest from certain weapon systems. After the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, within a month, the Norwegian pension fund, which is the largest sovereign pension fund in the world at $1 trillion, had completely divested from nuclear weapons and all fissionable material. And not long after that, Deutsche Bank, not known for being soft and fluffy and ethical, had divested from, had swept just fissionable material from its portfolio. That's the power of either public opinion and stigma, or what it could actually look like from an investment point of view when regulation comes into play. Because, once something looks uninvestable, either from law or because it looks like it will be a stigma for their investors and the people on their portfolio, then that's a powerful thing. So there's a lot that you can do. And I would look at the Future of Life pledge as well, because if you have any ability to sign it, then with any impact, then I would do that as well. And the last question, who should be responsible for providing guidelines, regulations on ethics for laws? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion on ethics specifically, but I think my personal view, there are lots of sort of ethic departments. There's the Ethics Institute. I think did I put the link to it, Neve, that was sent, that's doing a research piece for the Department of Science and Technology. But when you think about it, international law, and I think it goes back to Martin's clause saying that it has drawn from a kind of global consensus of what is morality and what is humanity. International law, international humanitarian law, and we already have the convention, the Covenant of Human Rights, the Human Rights Convention. That is a global consensus of ethics and morality coded into law. The laws of war code what is too far. They code the absolute limits of what we're supposed to get away with when there's a conflict, when there's a weapon in someone's hands. And then you have verification, accountability, and legal repercussions and sanctions. So ethics, to some extent, are very personal things. They can be cultural things. They can be philosophical. But in terms of who should be responsible for providing guidelines and regulations, I think international law and the UN are the closest we have to a global consensus on how ethics become coded into a law, and a broadly, without a police force enforcing it, but a somewhat enforceable guide to what we have decided as global society, as humanity, that what is too far and what we are not willing to permit, and what we won't do to each other. And that's what customary law was, that there wasn't something written, but there were just things that were agreed by behavior that was not permissible to do in times of war. And then after time, that behavior was so common that it became custom. It's just the done thing, or it's just not done, and it became law. And I think that is our guide on ethics, to the best of our ability. And that's why we make it law. And that's why these weapons should be banned, because they are they are unethical, unconscionable, and they already violate law because they cannot code that you protect civilians. They cannot code that you know intent, and they cannot code the intent of a commander. So I think that's the best answer I have for those rather big questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Taniel. I think that's a great note to end on. Although it is a very concerning and ongoing issue. So hopefully we'll see some progress on this. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. It was great of you to join for your evening. I hope this has been an enjoyable session, and thank you again to Taniel. I see that Andrew has put in the chat that our next webinar is a week today on the subject of science and Indigenous peoples. This will be the final event of the Festival of Ethical Science, so it would be wonderful if you could join. Yeah, so that's it from us. Thank you so much to the attendees, to Taniel, to Andrew for moderating. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.
Thank you very much for having me, everyone. It was really lovely to speak today, and I realise it's a midweek evening. And thank you, Neve and Andrew.